on this computer. And I want to welcome Coffee with a Purpose Select Board member, many hats, Kathryn Coughlin. We know her locally for all the wonderful things she does for Natick, but if you got a chance to look at the biographical information I shared ahead of this morning's talk, she has extensive experience as a scholar of the Mideast region. And so we're really fortunate to have her with us this morning to try to give us historical perspectives on what is unfortunately already the 1-month anniversary of the Hamas attack back in October. I believe Kathryn's plan, she's got slides to go through with us. I think it would work best if folks can withhold their questions until she gets through all of that. And then we'll use our usual method of using the raised hand function in Zoom, and I'll try to take questions in order. So without further ado, Kathryn, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Can you see the screen okay? Is it working out?
Yes. Yeah, we're seeing.
So I'm going to begin this presentation with a quote from David Remnick's in the Cities of Killing, New Yorker article on 10/28. The only way to tell the story is to tell it truthfully and to know that you will fail. I say that with all sincerity, and I know that this is such a difficult topic, and I'm trying to cram so much information in a short amount of space. So forgive me if I gloss over or leave out something you think is important. I'd like you to share that with me. So we're going to start this talk on Israel and Hamas with the topic of intellectual humility. So what is it, and what does it mean to be intellectually humble? So most of us are familiar with occasions when we need more confidence: public speaking, running for office, bystander intervention when we see injustice. But we rarely think that there are occasions when we need less confidence. When it comes to beliefs and opinions, many of us could do with a bit less confidence, myself included. So when it comes to research on the overconfidence bias, a recent study showed that 82% of people, when polled, thought they were right in the most recent disagreement that they had. So intellectually humble people know that their beliefs, opinions, and viewpoints are fallible because the evidence upon which they rely could be limited, it could be flawed. They may not have the expertise or ability to understand and evaluate the evidence. They may not have complete information. The sources they have upon which they rely might be biased, or they may not even know what questions to ask. For purposes of this presentation, I want to just take a quick look at can you see my cursor move when I move it on the screen, or no?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Wonderful. So this is the internationally demarcated green line. And so for purposes of this presentation, I'm going to refer to Israel as all of this area outside the green line, Palestine to mean the area of the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, Gaza to be the strip located along the Mediterranean and the Egyptian border, Jerusalem, which is really tiny here, to mean the borders of the city as internationally recognized, and the Golan Heights to mean the area captured by the Israelis from Syria in 1967. And then the settlements would be the towns that are located in the West Bank or Judea, Samaria, where the Israeli citizens live. And I'm separating out the Palestinian populations deliberately because they have very different, when polled prior to 10/7, had very, very different ideas about the peace process and their relationships to Israelis, which I hope we get to talk about. So where do you start? I provided a timeline, and I used a number of sources for that timeline. Some people look to Genesis 21:33, which describes the Treaty of Beersheba between Abraham and the Philistines. Philistine is literally the word Palestine in Arabic and in most ancient Semitic languages. Or we could look to 70 AD, where the Romans destroyed the Second Temple and expelled all of the Jews from Jerusalem. Or do we start with the Islamic conquest in 638? Or do we start with the Holocaust? for 48 and the establishment of Israel. Now, I used a number of sources. These are not in the order that I use them. But the problem with construction of a timeline is that one necessarily picks dates that support a narrative or a conception of relative importance, because you can't use every date. Something I found that I think will surprise you as it surprised me. Quickly going through here, the New York Times starts a timeline on the Arab-Israeli conflicts at 1948 with the creation of Israel. Council on Foreign Relations starts in 1947 with the UN Partition Plan. United Nations starts at 1885 when the word Zionism was first coined. Al Jazeera starts in a weird place. I've never seen this. In 1799, when Napoleon promised Palestine to the Jews of Europe. The Washington Post starts with World War I, 1914. Wikipedia very confidently states that it began in the late 1800s. And the American Jewish Committee starts in 1897 with the occasion of the first Zionist conflict. But what surprised me, and there were various textbooks I used, I pulled off my shelf from graduate work and things. What really surprised me is none of these or any of the timelines I consulted included the Holocaust. So when I sat down to prepare this, I had to narrow down how we think, like, what is my goal? Well, I started with goals, plural, but that's not possible. So what is my goal for this discussion here, my presentation to you? I want to try to explain how we got here today or a month ago. And that's so hard to do. And then when I posed that question, I thought, how did we get here? We are all involved in this conflict. However, unwittingly. As US citizens, our government has provided hundreds of billions of dollars to Israel and munitions. We're involved as friends of American Jews and Muslims and Christian Arabs. We're involved as we witness the extraordinary rise of anti-Semitism in the United States and Europe, and as we witness Jews who are removing their kippah or their yarmulkes and their mezuzah from their doors in fear, as we witness Muslim women who are removing headscarves in fear, and as we witness college campuses erupting with pro-Hamas demonstrations. So we're all involved in this conflict, ultimately as human beings. I'm going to start with the question of Palestine and the Jewish question, which I'll explain what that means. If you don't read German, that reads Jews out. And I'm going to start with a brief overview of Jews in Europe. So why Europe? Because they were the colonial powers carving up the rest of the world, and Europe was the primary theater of two world wars. Second World War saw the rise of Nazism and the decimation of Jews in Europe and increased immigration to Palestine. So what is this Jewish question, the Jewish problem? This phrase was first used in Great Britain in 1750. As Europe began to coalesce into nation states, they had to deal with civil, legal, national, political status, identity of Jews as a minority. So who are these people? If they're not, are they Germans or are they Jews? Are they French or are they Jews? This was first used in 1750 in Great Britain, and then after the French Revolution in 1789. Then the Germans talked about it in 1843 in a treatise called literally The Jewish Question. And you'll come to see why this is so important, this phrasing, the Jewish question. So by the late 19th century, hundreds of tracts and pamphlets and lectures and treatises and books offered, quote, solutions to the Jewish problem or the Jewish question. Resettling Jews in South Africa, deportation, assimilation, re-education, integration. European Jews themselves took up the question. Nathan Birnbaum coins the phrase Zionism and political Zionism and introduced Europe to the idea of the restoration of a Jewish state. Theodor Herzl, who you see on the right, is the founder of the Zionist movement. In 1897, the first Zionist Congress is held in Basel, Switzerland, and calls for a home for the Jewish people in Palestine secured under public law. Now, the word public law has no international legal meaning. Originally, the call was for secured under international law. But the Zionists decided that it would be probably ill-advised to anger the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan. So rather than saying under international law, they changed it to public law. Perhaps most significantly, Christian Zionists emerged in the UK and in the United States, advocating for the restoration of the Jews in Palestine. Their theology held that the second coming couldn't happen until Jews were restored to Israel and the third temple was built. So they were advocating for a restoration of Jews in Palestine. And this leads us to the phrase, a land without a people for a people without a land. This phrase was introduced by Christian Zionists originally in the UK and reflected their hopes for the restoration of the Jewish people in Israel. And this fulfilled their interpretation of biblical prophecy. So most of the economy, Palestine was sparsely, in the interior, sparsely inhabited, but those were Bedouin, Fellahin, which are peasants, and herders, goat herders, sheep herders. So there's wide swaths of land with a small number of people, but the land was being used. It just wasn't in agricultural use. Most of the economy was based in 6 cities. So Jerusalem, especially with pilgrimage traffic or pilgrimage tourists, Gaza in the south, Safed in the north, Nablus in the north, Ramla and Hebron in the south. The citrus industry, this is a really remarkable industry. By 1900, citrus was Palestine's main export, reaching its apex in the latter half of the 1930s when it composed 77% of the total value of exports from Palestine, keeping in mind that Palestine was exporting oil at this time. The citrus industry was a primary source of livelihood, and unlike other agricultural products, citrus was intended for export from the beginning. Nablus has been known for its soap making for over 1,000 years. Nabulsi soap is very famous in the Middle East and throughout parts of Eastern Europe. And the Toucan family soap factory was founded in Nablus in 1916, and that became an international export. Jaffa Electric Company, 1923, Palestine Airways, 1934, and their Kirkuk Haifa oil pipeline, which is from Kirkuk, Iraq, went through the Transjordan into Palestine and out of Haifa for export. So the idea of a land without a people for a people without a land was really more of a slogan than it was something that actually described the land. Here's some demographic history of the region of Palestine. So here's the region. I talked about some of these areas. So we talked about, here's Ramleh, Jerusalem, Haifa, Safed, these and Gaza for seafood. These were the main areas of industry. Now, I picked random years from the Ottoman census from 1800 to 1914. And I picked random dates to mark randomly kind of what was happening. So from 1800 to 1914, this is Ottomans, and the Ottomans did not count when in their census. This was really interesting for me. They didn't count Protestant Christians, Europeans, or American Christians in their census. So for Christians, they only counted Greek Orthodox and Greek Catholics who are Arabs. So for these years, I can guesstimate that the Christians here are Arabs, and that's about the percentage of the Arab population as a total, and you'll see spikes. So here we move to 1914, the beginning of World War I. These numbers are from the British. I didn't break out the percentage of Arab because they kept very detailed records on what community everyone was from, and that math was far too complicated for this. So between 1931 and 1945, you see a 506% increase in Jewish immigration, corresponding to the rise of Hitler and the legal and open persecution of Jews. At the time of the establishment of the State of Israel, the Jewish population in this entire region, this whole area, was roughly 31%. So one of my favorite subjects, the United Kingdom and Palestine, part 1. In 1915, the government of the United Kingdom issued a memorandum on the future of Palestine. These were the 5 goals. I'll let you read those while I just run through them. 2 months after the declaration of war on the Ottoman Empire, the British government issued this memo. And this is the first time in an official record of the United Kingdom that enlisting the support of Jews as a war measure was proposed. It's the last benefit here that I've highlighted. And that shaped pro-Zionist temperament of the United Kingdom from 1915 through the Second World War. In order to bring the United States into the war effort, the United Kingdom believed it needed to curry favor with American Jews who they believed wielded great influence. And there's another Jewish trope for you. Part 2, the next year they issued the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So this is a secret treaty. Sykes from the United Kingdom and Picot from France got together. They carved up the Ottoman Empire, assuming they're going to win World War I. And they allowed France to have some pieces, Italy to have some pieces. This agreement is seen as a turning point in Western and Arab relations. Now, the Arabs promised, I don't know if any of you watched T.E. Lawrence, but the Arabs promised to help the United Kingdom fight the Ottomans in exchange for independence and a national Arab homeland in Greater Syria, which at that time included Palestine. The Bolsheviks, in the meantime, had taken over in 1917, taken over Russia, and they published it. The Manchester Guardian picked it up 3 days later. And so this was a watershed point in Western Arab relations, and the Kurds in particular resented the agreement as they were left without a homeland. Now, the following year, 1917, the Balfour Declaration. The United Kingdom had a problem in 1917. They were in a stalemate with the Ottoman Empire. Their allies, the Russians, were busy with the Bolsheviks. The US had yet to fully commit, although they had declared war, they had fully to commit materiel. So the cabinet discussion that came about with this Balfour Declaration, the United Kingdom Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister wanted to bring the United States more fully on board, and they thought the way to do that was to curry favor with Zionist leaders. So they rounded up 9 Jewish British community leaders, Zionist and anti-Zionist, and said, we want to draft a letter for you to send to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland, and then on to the United States. And we want to see what you think about this. Now, what's interesting, you see if I, oh, no, sorry about that. What's interesting about this is that, and why am I spending so much time on this? Every single Arab curriculum I've ever seen covers these 3 documents. There are school children who don't know anything about their local history or even the Arab-Israeli wars, but they do know the Balfour Declaration and they do know Sykes-Picot. They see this as the ultimate betrayal of the Brits and by extension, the West. The opening words of this declaration was the first public expression for Zionism by a major power. Now, Mark Sykes of Sykes-Picot, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, wrote, I do not think it is possible to exaggerate the international power of the Jews. So this was their way of bringing the United States and more countries on board. So World War I, just some highlights. The first is Palestinian anti-Zionist newspaper is published. So during World War II, increased immigration by Palestinians and by Jews to Palestine kind of caught the attention of the intelligentsia, the Arab elite, and they started publishing newsletters. The Sharif of Mecca, who's the leader of Mecca and the person who would have been responsible for the District of Jerusalem, refuses to sign the Treaty of Versailles because of the Balfour Declaration and the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Britain governs Palestine as it had intended under a mandate from the League of Nations, and Jewish population increases by 116% in that war period. Now, in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, the Jewish Agency for Israel is established as a branch of the World Zionist Organization, specifically to encourage immigration to Israel. Now, Hitler becomes a democratically elected chancellor of Germany. Arab revolts in Palestine coincide with a peak influx of Jews that were fleeing violence and anti-Semitism. And the United Kingdom investigates violence in Palestine and recommends a partition. Understands it just can't manage what's happening. World War II, we see Arabs and Jews in Palestine attack each other, settlements, towns, burn them down, run them out. That's a whole class in itself. Arabs also revolted against the British military, blowing up train lines, attacking British military installations. And the UK responds to the violence in Palestine by limiting Jewish immigration from Nazi Germany at the height of Nazi power, 1939. Now, this provoked armed Jewish resistance. The Irgun and the Stern Gang are two of the most well-known. There's another one, and they worked together, and then they didn't. But both groups offered underground assistance to Jews fleeing Europe and resettlement in Palestine. What you see over on the left is the SS Exodus. That was the name of the boat. It was a vessel carrying Jewish refugees from France who wanted to settle in Palestine. This is after World War II. Many were Holocaust survivors. The British forbade entry into Israel of European Jews and turned the ship around and sent it back to France, with the majority of its passengers still on board. So this is despite the pressure of world opinion and Harry S. Truman, who was the first foreign leader to recognize the state of Israel, and my personal hero. Full-scale riots, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, follow, both by Arabs and by Palestinians. British wipe their hands of Palestine, they turn it over to the United Nations. Now, the United Nations comes up with Resolution 181. That's the map on your left. 1947, it says, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have some mixed populations, but the blue area is going to be the Jewish state, and the green area will be the Arab state. And then the city of Jerusalem would be governed by a international group. Oops. So on the right is what actually happened. So when, so the United Nations presents this to the Jewish communities and the Arab communities in Israel. Arabs say, absolutely not. And the Jews say, this is the best we're going to get, so let's take it. A counter proposal from the Arabs was offered. Only those Jews and their descendants who had arrived before the Balfour Declaration would become citizens of the Jewish state. That was rejected on its face. So the plan was almost immediately followed by widespread violence. Israel declares statehood in May 1948, followed by an invasion by Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon. The war resulted in the expansion of Israeli territory. So what we have here is Jordan came in and took over what is known as the West Bank of the River Jordan. Gaza was taken over by Egypt, and the war resulted in the UN Resolution 194, which called for the return of all Arab refugees. So what I'm going to do is take you through these Arab-Israeli wars, so you have a sense just kind of the timeline of what happens. In 1967 is the first major war after 1948. Egypt defeats Jordan, Egypt, and Syria in a 6-day war, and they take over the entire Sinai Peninsula. They get back Gaza, the West Bank, and they take over the Golan Heights from Syria. So these pink areas are what they acquired. The UN passes another resolution, 242. It's a very important resolution. It essentially establishes a formula for peace, land for peace. So the next major war was in 1973. It's known as the Yom Kippur War, or the October War, or the Ramadan War. Egypt and Syria attempt to retake the Sinai Peninsula. And what they're most concerned about, the Egyptians and the Israelis, is the Suez Canal. And that's a whole other crisis that we're not going to cover. But that's a very, very important tradeway for Israel and for actually the world. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria staged a surprise attack on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. The Israeli military were caught off guard and unprepared, took 3 full days to mobilize. This led other Arab states to kind of pile on. And in addition, these Arab countries that were oil exporters agreed to enforce an oil embargo on the United States. And if any of you remember 1973, gas prices went up 4-fold, oil went up 4-fold. And the OPEC countries used oil as a political weapon to gain support against Israel. What's interesting to me about 73 is that Jordan didn't take part in this attack. In fact, King Hussein of Jordan flew to Tel Aviv to meet with Golda Meir, went to Jerusalem to tell her that this was going to happen. He said, they kind of talked about it. They didn't say they were going to do it. We don't want any part of it. We want you to know about that. This was the night before the attacks. And Israel was still caught off guard. So those are the major wars. Let's look at the peace agreements. The first substantive peace agreement, or the first peace agreement, was in 1978, the Camp David Accords. Anwar Sadat first visits Jerusalem in 1977. They were having back channel peace negotiations, and following 2 weeks of secret negotiations at Camp David, Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin agreed to a framework for peace, which is the most important stepping stone. You start with a framework. Both parties agreed to Resolution 242, land for peace. Israel will give up land in exchange for peace. The following year, Menachem Begin visited Cairo, and Israel withdraws from the Sinai Peninsula. So that's what you were seeing back here. So these this is what they caught, and then incrementally they gave back the Sinai in exchange for peace. In 1987, the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza rose up against the Israeli military rule. This is the first Intifada. Hoping to stop the violence and address Palestinian grievances, Secretary of State George Shultz called for an international conference. The Israelis rejected this because the proposal did not call for an end to the Intifada, admittedly something George Shultz could not have controlled. The bilateral talks, though, bore some fruit so George Bush, Mikhail Gorbachev get together and they say, let's come to Madrid. This is the first time there were face-to-face talks by Israelis, Egyptians, Syrians, Lebanese, Palestinians, and Jordanians. They came out of it with no definitive agreements, but what did happen is there were bilateral talks among the different groups. And even though by 1993, the talks were deadlocked on Palestine, Hussein and the Israelis signed a peace agreement in 1994. Oslo 1. So this is the first face-to-face agreement between the Israelis and the PLO. Yitzhak Rabin, Yasser Arafat, and Bill Clinton signed a document that outlined a framework and acknowledged each other's existence. So Israel acknowledged that the PLO was the representative of the Palestinian people, and the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist and renounced terrorism and violence. So here you have kind of what they were talking about. They were talking about affirming the Palestinian right to self-government. There's going to be an interim, this is important, an interim self-governing authority, but the permanent status, things like Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, security, borders, that will be at the end of 5 years during this interim period. What's interesting is this interim period would end on May of 1999. Oslo Accords too. So now this is the map of what the Oslo Accords allowed. So the Palestinians would have complete jurisdiction over all of the brown areas. Area B would be joint security and policing, and Area C would be only the Israeli army. So as soon as possible, but not later than 1996, negotiations on permanent status would be started. And that never happened. So what happened between 1996 and 2006? During that 10-year period, Palestinian elections are held, but Hamas refuses to participate. And Fatah, which is the ruling party now in the West Bank, won those elections both in Gaza and in the West Bank. The leader of the opposition in the Israeli Knesset, or their parliament, Ariel Sharon, visited the Dome of the Rock compound, which ignites the second intifada. UN Security Council affirms a two-state solution. No one seems to be listening. There's a roadmap for peace, which we'll talk about. But Hamas wins the election in 2006, largely because there's been no progress. Those previous peace agreements that you saw had these dates of 1996, 1999, and here we are in 2006, and Hamas convinced the Palestinian people that the negotiations were not worth entering. Now, in 2003, the United States, the European Union, United Nations, and Russia got together and came up with a roadmap for peace. Now, if you don't see the problem with this, I'll explain it to you. If you have two warring parties and you have four outside parties that are going to come together and tell you what the roadmap for peace is going to look like, but those two parties are not at the table, it's doomed to fail. If you read this, it sounds like something a McKinsey consultant wrote. Performance-based, goal-driven, clear phases, timelines, target dates, benchmarks. So after the failure of the roadmap to peace in 2005, because it was supposed to have a comprehensive settlement 2 years later, Hamas defeated Fatah in 2006. So who are Hamas and Islamic Jihad? Although they are both committed to the destruction of Israel, they differ on how to achieve that goal. They both want to establish an Islamic state, but that looks very different to both of them theologically and ideologically. So, for example, Palestinian Islamic Jihad is, it's just more extreme ideologically. In Hamas, you have women doctors, you have women going to school, you have, it's much more liberal in gender and women relations, for example. But they're both extreme. So Hamas is much larger. It has a social welfare system. It has a politburo. They have a policy decision. They have a governing body. They have a prime minister, and they have the military wing, which is what you saw on October 7th. Israel has allowed hundreds of millions of dollars from Qatar to be funneled into, actually, it was under the Likud party and under Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has repeatedly explained, and we'll see this a little bit later, that it's really good to prop up Hamas because that divides the leadership between the West Bank and Hamas. And it's kind of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Hamas also collects taxes on goods that come from Egypt via the tunnels, and they are much bigger, 20 to 25,000 members. Palestinian Islamic Jihad has no interest in governance. They focus solely on the military. They have less sophisticated weaponry, which is what we saw in the hospital attack, where it was a missile, not a bomb. They get about 70 million a year from Iran, and they have about 1,000 members. Most of those are in Gaza, although there are some in the West Bank. This is a picture outside one of the barrier walls that separates Palestine from Israel. This one I'm going to have to read. So what are the obstacles to peace? For the Palestinian, this factor is the Nakba. So it all centers on 1948. And if you haven't had a chance to listen or read the transcript to the, I forgot the name of it, that Bill Ramaj sent around, I strongly suggest you do it. The psychological factor, in my opinion, is the single biggest stumbling block. For the Palestinians, it's the Nakba. That's the expulsion of the local Palestinians when the UN decided to partition Palestine. For Palestinians, it's the Palestinian refugees from the 1940s and their descendants, regardless of whether they were forced out or whether they fled. Excuse me, the Palestinians want them and their descendants to return. Their original villages and homes, their rights must somehow be restored or at least accounted for. For the Israelis, it's simply the Holocaust. It occupies a central role as a psychological factor. Centuries of discrimination, exclusion, oppression, culminating in the systematic destruction of 6 million Jews, has a place in the psyche of most, if not all, Jews everywhere. Another obstacle to peace is the failure to realize peace through negotiation. We saw that there have been numerous peace attempts with frameworks and steps and plans and time-bound, whatever the McKinsey speech is, and peace has not been realized. And that is also part of the psychological factors. But it's hard to convince people to come back to the table if peace has not been realized. Bad faith politics. The political situation in Israel has both leading parties agreed on the need for continued Israeli control over the occupied territories. And on the Palestinian side, Hamas's challenge to Fatah weakens Palestinian leadership. In both societies, alienation from moderate leaders and potential peacemakers has become widespread, with more demagogic, violent elements gaining ground. The United States. So the United States, under the leadership of President Donald Trump, has not used its status to leverage agreement. Rather, by presenting a peace plan, put that in quotes, in 2020, that reflects the most right-wing of Israeli positions, the United States has become a barrier to the compromises needed for peace. In simple terms, United States backing for Israel's right-wing political camp not only strengthens the trend in Israel, but it also contributes to the frustration and growing extremism at the edges of the two societies. Religious Zionist settlements in the West Bank, and then also Israel's existential threat from Hamas and Islamic Jihad. So settlements. In the early days post-67, the Israeli government encouraged settlements along the Jordan River as kind of a bulwark. So if you picture the West Bank, this middle of the spine, right down the middle, is a mountain range. These are coastal plains to the west, and to the east, it kind of slopes off into Jordan and down to the Jordan River. So originally, the idea was civilian settlers might serve as a first line of defense. And under that approach, early on, the Israeli government forbade a Jewish settlement near heavily populated Arab areas. Now, over time, Messianic religious Zionist ideology developed as a strong driver of the settlement movement based on the notion of a religious imperative for Jews to settle the entire land of Israel. It's also important to understand that when you look at the map of Israel, biblically, the most significant parts is Judea and Samaria, which is, largely the West Bank and Jerusalem. So settlements established as part of this religious movement were often placed in regions along this mountain ridge on the top, where they look down over the Palestinian villages. So why are West Bank settlements a problem? They're an impediment to peace because they broaden Israel's footprint. They disrupt Palestinian contiguity. I practice saying that, contiguity. They undermine Palestinian trust. They shape a public perception. They burden Israeli security, which has to fortify them and respond to both settler on Palestinian violence and Palestinian on settler violence. And it just exacerbates the violence among the communities or between the communities. So where do we go from here? And this is where I'm going to kind of turn it over to you. This, for those who have not been to Israel, this is an image of Masada. It's a fortification in the Judean desert overlooking the Dead Sea. According to the 1st century Roman Jewish historian Josephus, about 1,000 Jewish rebels escaped Roman destruction of Jerusalem and hid atop this fortress. When the Romans arrived, they built a siege ramp along the wall, and the Romans breached the fortress with a battering ram. They discovered that its defenders had set all the buildings but the food stores ablaze and committed mass suicide or killed each other, 960 men, women, and children. Now, the archaeological evidence is ambiguous at best, but the mythos or the myth is that the Jews would rather kill themselves than surrender, And I fear that the Arabs are in the same place now. So this is where I want to leave the discussion to you. Where do we go from here? And to answer questions.
Wow. uh, my mind is spinning, Kathryn. Um, there's so much that you covered.
There we go. So in a brief overview, what we have is the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, driving immigration into Palestine, fights about it, the UN coming in with resolution after resolution, Western powers coming in with, well, actually the Camp David Accords were the Israelis and the Arabs coming together. But after that, we have Western governments coming in and coming up with a framework and setting these dates, which have a real solid meaning. I was in the West Bank during the early Oslo period, and I was teaching at a university in Najaf. And the attitudes of the Palestinians in the early Oslo period was so much different than it was when I was there during the first Intifada. There was hope. There was a sense that something's going to happen. It's not going to be exactly what we want, but there was a sense of progress. And then I saw the steady decline over the years. So, yeah, that's a lot. So why don't I just open it up to...
Yeah, Rick, I think, has his hand up. Rick, do you want to come off mute?
Yeah. Well, first off, Kathryn, thank you. There's a lot of great history in there. What you've thrown us to discuss, I feel a little like Sykes and Picot, kind of two low-level nobodies, who were kind of came up with something that ended up being so controversial. I mean, what we can do is participate in elections first and foremost. And though you've said little about Donald Trump, you've said enough, and we all know really just what an impact he's had everywhere and in the Middle East. And I think that's the most important thing we can do, is to not reelect somebody on the outside who basically would just, like, as he likes to do to most of his enemies, smite them and make them disappear from the earth. Where that leads, God knows. I don't know. I don't have a solution. I don't know. I didn't know where to begin, but I feel like I'm not sure. Maybe somebody else can start this discussion in a way that will be entertaining, at least.
Yeah, I guess following from that, Rick, I guess what I'd like to ask Kathryn is, you mentioned President Trump's contribution to the situation. What has the United States done since then, during the Biden administration in particular?
Nothing. There's been no, I think Biden has been very focused on coming out of COVID, the economy, and the domestic agenda. There hasn't been, well, I will throw you a bone. So I don't think there's been much under the Biden administration. But with regard to the obstacles to peace, we talked about the settlements. The settlements would collapse without the Israeli government's support. And so a third of the settlers are Haredi, who don't work and are supported by subsidies from the government. A third of them are secular, and a third of them are religious Zionists. A lot of the construction is financed by the Israeli government to move population centers from around the Jerusalem area up into the West Bank and to settle it. And if that financial aid were cut off, they wouldn't be able to financially be sustainable. So, and I don't think that they preclude a peace agreement. There's not enough of the settlements. There's a lot of them, and they're big, but there aren't enough of them to displace the Palestinian population. So it isn't the case. Looking forward to like a framework, I don't see that there'd be a huge population exchange. So that's some good news. I think, looking at the settlements as an obstacle, I do think that the United States needs to get out of the way. The only time in US history where the United States has pushed back on Israel's building of settlements or its use of money was when George H.W. Bush, a one-term president, said, we will release the money that we give money to both Israel and Egypt as a result of the Camp David Accords. And we do that every year. And so we will release that money as long as you promise not to use it for settlements. Now, this is just kind of like accounting, right? So yeah, they wouldn't use it for settlements, but then they would take the money they used for settlements, but they still really pushed back. And he was a one-term president. So I do think that the United States needs to kind of get out of the way. I'm not suggesting for a minute that we not stand with Israel against terrorism and condemn it and support Israel. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I'm suggesting is it's a lot more complicated than slogans and writing checks and sending munitions.
Pat, did you want to contribute?
Yes. Hi, Kathryn. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was outstanding. I was curious about the recent, relatively recent, in the last 6 months, a year, the divisiveness in Israel over what the Supreme Court and the sort of swerve towards orthodox, really conservative politics, and Netanyahu and all that divisiveness within Israel had contributed to, say, October 7th.
So I had a slide, that was one of the ones I pulled out, that looks at the current cabinet makeup. So in the current cabinet makeup, in order for Netanyahu to have won the election and taken power, he had to make deals with some pretty nasty folk. People who, I don't have the names in the slide in front of me and I'm going to mess it up, but the Minister of Defense has stated that, I'm not going to go there because I don't have those facts in front of me, but it caused Israeli society to convulse. Hamas really picked the wrong time. I mean, not that there's ever a right time, but what I'm saying is, if they thought that this was going to destroy Israel, what it's done is it's united the country. Before this, you saw the protests. Netanyahu was hanging on to power by the skin of his teeth and having to give up concessions on the judiciary. I think that this attack, what it's done is it's brought the left, right, and center together. They have a unity government now, and they're united more than they were divided before. And that's a shame.
Thank you.
I mean, a shame for peace is what I mean. Not it's a shame that they're united.
We have a question in the chat thing that goes more to your personal story, Kathryn, as to kind of what motivated you to be studying this part of the world in the first place.
When I was an undergraduate, I went to college late. So I started when I was 26 because I helped raise my brother and sisters. So when I started as a freshman at a small college in Kentucky, and I learned that I could do an independent study and they would pay for it because as part of my I'm being very honest with you, as part of my scholarship, I picked a topic on law. So I wanted to do an independent study looking at the application of international law in the West Bank. But specifically, how do you resolve conflicts when you don't have police, you don't have courts, all you have is a military government. And the military isn't interested if, Omar down the street took your donkey. So how do you resolve these conflicts? How do you resolve personal status issues, divorce? And I learned that there were Christian courts. There's a Orthodox, there was Melkite, Maronite, there's like 6 Christian communities. They all had their own personal status courts. So I put together a proposal and I said, I want to go to the West Bank. And it was during the early days of the Intifada. And my school said, go. And I had no language skills. I arrived in Jerusalem. It was rainy and it was cold. It was December, which is, if you've ever been in Israel in December, it's right in your bones. It's awful. And I was 27 and I didn't know anything. I knew nothing. I knew less than nothing. I mean, I had this great idea. And I spent time going in and out from Jerusalem, going in and out of the West Bank to Ramallah and to Bethlehem, meeting with people. And I was so fortunate. I had so many Arabs who took me under their wing and introduced me to this judge or this lawyer or so and put me in a car and sent me in a service taxi to the next place. So that was December 92 until August 93. I was there for 9 months. During that time, I was only supposed to be there a month. I called my college and said, because you didn't have internet or, so I called my school, my dean at like 6 or 7 in the morning and said, I'm not coming back. What I'm going to do is send you 4 independent study proposals, Bedouin poetry, Islamic philosophy. I came up with stuff and I faxed it to them and I said, walk them through the academic council. I'm staying here. I can't go home now. I got a job with the Arab Human Rights, got an apartment in Nazareth, got a job with the Arab Human Rights Association there, translating. By translating, I mean, they translated their Arabic into English, and then I cleaned up their English quite a bit. And then I worked with B'Tselem in Jerusalem, which is an Israeli human rights organization. And I spent time just traveling all over the region. The following year, and then I'll just tell you this one short story. The following year, my independent study was during the summer before my senior year. I hitchhiked from Istanbul to Jerusalem along the Crusader route. And so I took T.E. Lawrence's master's thesis at Oxford. And I said, I want to recreate this. I want to study military architecture as if I knew what that was. But I wanted to see what these castles were like and what that whole part of the world was. So I went from Istanbul to Ankara and then over to Syria. I was in Syria for 3 weeks under Hafez al-Assad. So the current dictator's father, who was brutal. And when people ask me, weren't you afraid to be in Syria? And I was like, no, because the Muhabarat, the secret police, were following me everywhere. I was so safe. So I was there, and then I went to Jordan, and then through Jordan into Jerusalem, and then finished up at Akko, which is a Crusader or Acre it's Crusader city on the Mediterranean. And that's when I decided to do Arab studies. So I got my master's in Arab studies at Georgetown and worked on this topic, the Israeli-Palestinian relations or Arab-Israeli relations was in 1995 so volatile that I picked my dissertation topic in 1997 to be medieval Spain, because I never wanted to have to teach this in a university. It's painful. People want easy answers. They want everything summed up. They want to know like what happened when and why. And it's so much more complicated than that. So I picked medieval Spain, looking at Islamic law, women and gender, marriage contracts with Jewish contracts, Muslim contracts, and Christian canon law. And then in 2001, when 9/11 happened, I left my dissertation and went into public service. So I worked in public diplomacy, and that's pretty much the long and short of it. And then I came here and I ran for select board. So
makes perfect sense.
Perfect sense. No, I left. I was at Harvard. I was the executive director of the Islamic Studies program. And I left there in 2016 after 10 years to buy a liquor store. So I did that perfect transition, very seamless. I did that for 4 years.
Were you saying the situation led you to drink? Is that?
So I feel like I'm among friends, although we are recording this.
Yes.
When I wanted to leave academia, I thought, like, what do I know? And what has like a monetary value? So this was under what administration? 2017. Who was the president? All I remember is thinking I'm not going to be able to do much with Islamic studies. So
Trump.
I don't know. Who was that?
By then it was Trump, right?
Trump. Okay. So at whatever point I realized that had no monetary value. I am marksman, so I used to shoot competitively. I don't want to be in the gun industry. And I know wine and I know tequila, so I'll buy a liquor store. So I got to there, and then after 4 years, after COVID, well, it was still in COVID, my husband said, sell the store. You can do whatever you want to do, just sell the store. And so I said, great. So I sold the store and I retired. And now I read stuff for the select board. That's pretty much it.
Which is full-time in and of itself. Brinley, you've got your hand up.
I am wow, just wow. Thanks, Kathryn. I I'm not really it's so much to absorb, so I'm not really sure I have a lot of comments about um what we talked about, except to say that I hope you don't mind if I share this with my children, especially my son, because he came home last night talking about all of the demonstrations that are going on in the country right now, but even in our town and downtown Boston and just everywhere, and trying to understand both sides. And he said, we're not getting both sides in school. We're getting this side or that side, and we're not really getting a clear picture of history. And I'm trying to understand why I should say I stand with Israel versus I stand with the Jewish people versus I'm against anti-Semitism versus Palestinian rights for the people. And he was really yes. I found myself a little bit at a loss in having a conversation with him about it, because I myself only know so much, and tried to explain it from a human point of view, human in terrorism and Jewish history. And I would love to be able to share this with my son. I think that it would really clarify a lot of his questions that I couldn't answer. Are you okay with if I do that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll send my slide. I saw a couple of typos, so I'm going to clean it up and send it to Doug to send out to whoever wants it, or so you could have the actual slides. I think the most important thing, if you're talking to children, and actually for all of us, is to recognize that saying I stand with Israel, or saying it's important, but it's also a slogan. So what does that mean? What are you doing? We have synagogues in our area that are debating whether or not to allow their members to carry guns. And we have people who are really scared. And in Cambridge, I have a girlfriend who's an American convert to Islam, and she's blonde. And so she covers her hair because she feels like she's just like, anyway, she covers her hair. She stopped covering her hair. And I said, how are you unsafe in Harvard Yard? Like, I don't understand that, because all I see is the pro-Hamas stuff. And she said, it's not Harvard Yard. It's when you get outside and people look at you and they just throw you. She just feels so vulnerable. So I think the best thing to tell kids is sometimes these are slogans. And when you challenge somebody, what do you mean by Israel is a settler colonial power? What does that mean? Do you know what that means? And what's the context you're using that in? Or Israel's an apartheid state. Explain what you mean to me by that. So push back on people, ask them to give you more information, whether you agree with them or not, because you may learn something that you didn't know before. It all kind of goes back to that intellectual humility, which I think we all need to practice, is by saying, I don't know. And that's okay. It's perfectly fine. I say, I don't know a lot. Saying I don't know is healthy, and letting kids be free to say, this isn't something I understand, and I don't want to go back to Genesis 20:13 or whatever it is. I just want kind of an overview, and then they can delve in where they need to. But the most important thing is to teach them that these are all human beings, and people have been really, really hurt on both sides. I'm not equivocating. I'm not saying one is equal to the other. I'm not saying anything like that. What I'm saying is these are all human beings. They've all been damaged. They've all been hurt. And that's why I think it's part of we. Rick brought up a good point. We should be voting. We should be paying attention to the news. Look for bias in your news sources. Question. And when somebody wants to draw you into an argument and just assume you agree, ask them, tell me more about that. We don't have time for that anymore, do we? We don't take time to ask people, tell me more about that.
We have a couple of hands up, but before I take those questions, following up from Brindley's son's comment of we're only getting one side of the story, and your comment, Kathryn, about being aware of your biases. I wonder if you want to take a moment to speak about one of the materials you sent us in preparation for this talk was your sources, and you've got a lot in there about identifying what not only what the bias orientation is of some of the, excuse me, I just want to mute Bill for a second, what the bias is of that source, but also how to determine bias. If you want, I can share the screen for you where you had that, or you can bring it up yourself.
Could you do that? I'm trying to do it. I have two screens and I'm confused.
Sure. Let me see if I can find it myself. I know I had it here. Let's see.
Oh, I have it.
Gosh, do you have it?
I do.
Okay.
So I'm actually going to add a name to this. There's this fantastic, I'd totally forgotten about him, fantastic Israeli who's an expert in the land of Israel, expert down to like latitude and longitude. He's been involved in all of the peace negotiations and in the land swaps. He has tremendous teaching resources, and I'm going to add his name, and I'm just so tired, I can't remember. I'll add his name to the sources and resend it out. But so there's a website, and I list that in the how to evaluate news you're reading.
Right.
So first,
are you going to share it yourself, or are you? Yeah.
Oh, I'm hoping I can do that. I can share my screen. You taught me how. Let's see.
You were sharing your presentation earlier. If you can't, I can try to bring it up.
I can't figure out how to do this.
There, I think I've
down at the bottom, I think, of your.
There we go. I'm sharing for you. So this is one of the things that we sent out ahead of this talk. Folks that you are reading, and then news sources, what biases they have, and towards the bottom, how to evaluate the news that you're reading.
So number 3, I would go there and put in what you normally read. And this uses an algorithm. Allsides.com uses an algorithm to spot media bias. It's super accurate. So for example, for the Wall Street Journal, it says its news is central, which is pretty spot on, but its op-eds tend to be right, or even more right. So learning to recognize logical fallacies, that's really important. So when you're reading an article, you learn to identify a straw man argument. You learn to identify the slippery slope, which is honestly, it's really lazy. I hate it when people say that's a slippery slope, because it's extraordinarily lazy and it's not terribly helpful. Read original sources. So if somebody says the Hamas charter says XYZ, okay, so Hamas charter, unfortunately, is super, super long. But if you can resort to it, or ask, look for like a footnote to see that they actually went and looked at it, as opposed to categorizing what's being said. Know about the source. So any decent website that has blogs on it, has teaching materials, has editorials, research, data, maps, will tell you its mission. It may tell you its funding, and you'll get a sense of what its bias is. So B'Tselem, in the human rights organization that I worked with back in the 90s, was it was left, but right now it's very far. I think it's pretty far left. It's absorbed a lot of the academic flabby thinking about like kind of throwing things around. So they'll say apartheid state, settler colonial, without defining why they're saying that. Okay, another thing that's really important, go to Snopes.com. So for example, when an IDF force soldier said that he had seen beheaded babies, that was picked up by everybody. And then Snopes debunked it by going back through all of tracked it back to one person, and then brought that to the IDF and said, did this happen? Now, atrocities happened, but are we setting up Hamas to be compared with ISIS? Because they're two entirely different things. And so Snopes is important. Another source, and it's really complicated, but I'll just kind of tell you about it. When the hospital was hit, the Al Ahli hospital in Gaza, And immediately the Arab press and the Western press immediately jumped in and said, Israel did this. In 6 hours, I knew that that was not the case, because there are open source internet resources. There are people who take a picture, for example, somebody tweets a picture and it shows a pile of babies that are dead. They take that picture and they can look at the metadata and narrow it down to its exact latitude and longitude. No, this was taken in Syria, or this is photoshopped, or this is a picture from a different atrocity. So those sources are really helpful. I didn't introduce them here because they're super complicated. I mean, I don't use them. I follow people who do, but I knew within 6 hours. And it was interesting to me when the IDF was interviewed about it on CNN, and I don't remember which show it was. There was a public affairs officer, and he said, you know, all the reasons why. And he's like, well, it's definitely a missile because it's a shallow crater and it's not this. And then he was so exasperated by the, you know, prove it to me, prove it to me, prove it to me. He said, if that had been an Israeli bomb, the hospital would not be there. Like, we don't make mistakes like that. We don't hit a parking lot. And I thought, gosh, how calloused are we that we have to resort to everybody would be dead if it were us. But I sense the man's frustration because he's trying to say, it doesn't matter what I say. It doesn't matter what I show you. It doesn't matter. You're not going to believe it. So know about your source, its bias, its funding, study those logical fallacies. That's really helpful. Because then when you're reading an op-ed and you start to follow the thread and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. You may be able to pick out logical fallacies and pick apart the argument. And it also sharpens your mind. It's a really good thing for all of us to do.
Thank you for spending a couple of minutes on that. I want to go back to the questions now. Paul, you had your hand up.
Kathryn, great presentation. Learned a lot this morning. My population, the veterans and families and so forth, are really impacted regardless of their race, religion, or nationality. It's an event going on in the world that triggers memory of things that happened to many of my combat veterans, and it's 3 weeks ago, two days in a row, I had priorities out for suicide. Were they triggered by these events? Very well could have been. My generation certainly has been triggered by events like this. But even in my own home, Kathryn, you know, my own family, and we talk, you know, discuss, you know, and the big thing I take out of what you're saying, Kathryn, I'll never be as educated as you in this area, but what I try to do is read up on as much factual information as I can. So when I talk to somebody, I'm going to over halfway know what I'm talking about. But you brought up some great perspectives to me this morning, Kathryn, and I really thank you for that.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks for that, Paul. Pat, you had your hand up again. You're on mute, Pat. You got to come off mute. Here you go.
Yes, Kathryn, earlier you mentioned how you think the U.S. should kind of get out of the way. I was a little confused about that. I didn't know exactly. I thought that America and the EU and the democratic countries were supposed to be kind of a referee in this and helping, you know, not only support Israel, but keep the thing from getting a horrible regional war or lots of civilian deaths. And so I was curious what you meant by that, you know, how America should sort of get out of the way.
Pat, I really appreciate the question and the opportunity to clarify that. So what I mean by getting out of the way, the United States has tremendous power. We have military power, we have economic power. We've lost the moral high ground in the Muslim world, which is 1 billion people, and in many other countries, especially countries where Great Britain was, where you have communal violence, because they look to the United States and how we've failed, despite trying or being involved in, we've failed at achieving peace. So what I mean by getting out of the way is using soft power, using our influence with the government of Israel to say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to help you do this, but you have to do something. It can't just be writing checks and sending armaments. At the same time, sitting down with the Palestinians and saying, you need to get real. And the problem with that is we don't really have a strong Palestinian government. The Fatah government in the West Bank is corrupt. It has long been corrupt. It is not respected by the residents of the West Bank. When I lived in Nablus and I was teaching at An-Najah University, I was out on my balcony and I looked next door and there was the Palestinian Navy. Now, Nablus is landlocked and they don't have much fishing rights off Gaza. But here was the office of the Palestinian Navy. And that ended up being a joke at the university amongst the Palestinian students. So you don't have a strong partner with. So figure out, how do we help them build a strong partner, but using soft power, back channel diplomacy. I appreciate your comment, Pat. I mean, the democracies should be getting together and helping people solve intractable problems, but we haven't proved very efficient at that. And usually we do it for our own purposes. And so we, the United States, in my opinion, need to think about peace and what's best for the people who live there. Nobody's going anywhere. We've got 2 people living in one area of land, and the Palestinians aren't going anywhere willingly, and the Israelis aren't going anywhere willingly. So I kind of think about, when I say get out of our way, let's stop looking at this through the lens of what's best for the United States and figure out how we, using our military and our economic power, get the parties to sit down. How do we strengthen Fatah? Maybe that's something that's done back channel. Maybe Abbas, Mahmoud Abbas, who's the PNA, the Palestinian National Authority, or the PLO leader, the successor to Arafat, maybe we nudge him out and get someone young in there, somebody who wants government reform. I appreciate the opportunity to clarify that. I don't mean leave them to their own devices. I just think we need to think about this a lot differently than we have in the past.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead, Rick. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you knew our efforts at diplomacy, seem to be led, when we read in the newspapers, they seem to be read by State Department officials, State Department people and administration people. Is there any level underneath that that's not visible, in which you have people who are not so much politically motivated, but are really experienced negotiators who would look at things like this and try to figure out who has what to gain from where we are now? In other words, I can't help but do that with this war, and it's so complicated your mind boggles, because the single person who has the most to gain from this war is probably not even in the region. It's probably Vladimir Putin, in my opinion. And that's not a terribly well-informed opinion, and I'm certainly not going to stick to it, but I see all kinds of ways that his effort to divide us and to distract us from Ukraine and his influence in the region already, with Hezbollah, Jordan, through Iran and so forth, are really, really dangerous. And that region needs help sorting that out. I don't know who could help them sort that out, but it's very worrisome.
There are people in the State Department who work in public diplomacy. So that's one of the things I did when I was there. And I did that in the Muslim world, and where people who are experts in a particular area work with policy analysts to come up with answers to policy questions. The problem is they're not taken terribly seriously by the politicians at the table. So for example, in the list of resources I gave you, there's a woman named Farah Pandith. She's an expert on Islamic extremism, just like Graham Wood over at The Atlantic. The difference is Graham Wood has written articles and books based on Islam through his interactions with Islamic extremism. So that's all he knows is he's met people in ISIS, Al-Qaeda, he spent time in Iraq. Farah Pandith is an expert on the radicalization of youth, on terror and counterterrorism, and U.S. foreign policy. And her focus is on soft power approaches to extremism, understanding that it's hard to win hearts and minds without some sort of, and she combines it with hard power. I mean, she's not saying just go in there and let's all hug it out. She's very serious about combining it with hard power. But if you're only using hard power, war, drones, bombs, you're creating another generation of Hamas, or to the more extreme of that. I find it terribly frustrating when I hear the discourse about we're going to eliminate Hamas, because even if you eliminate every single Hamas person, you've created another generation of people who have suffered tremendous losses, and they're going to be even to the right of Hamas. Hamas, there's a, what is his name? Sari Nusseibeh. So there are two families that are Muslim in Jerusalem, the Nusseibehs and the Husseinis. Both of these families go back about 1,000 years. And when the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, when the six Christian factions were fighting uncontrollably about control over who was going to have mass on what day at what time and who had control of what altar and what chapel, they all got together and they gave the keys to the church, the Holy Sepulchre, to these two Muslim families, and they passed it down for 1,000 years. Now, Sari Nusseibeh lives in Arab East Jerusalem. He's a scholar. One of the things he said is, Hamas is not an entity, it's an idea. And you can't bomb an idea out of existence. And I read that and it's kind of profound. But then what do? Because you certainly can't live alongside an enemy that is an existential threat. That's the intractable question.
Thank you.
Also, Doug, just one
Go
more
ahead,
thing.
yeah.
I was going to advise you. So Haaretz gives and that's on the list of news sources. They offer a free daily newsletter. I get it every day. It says, day 31, day 30, what's happened. I encourage you to take news timeouts, because this is a lot and it is heavy and it is depressing. And when I offered to do this, I didn't realize how much down that wormhole I would go and how to like wrap your hands around something so big. And it got depressing. So I encourage you to take, just like you take social media breaks or anything for your mental health, step away from the news. You're going to catch up. And yeah, that's all I want to say.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, not just for the tip for us to take timeouts when we need it for our own mental health, but to acknowledge what you've done for us in preparing for this, that you've taken this deep dive, and there's been a cost for you. I wanted to invite both Rick and Bill Ramage to speak for a moment, if they wanted to, about the two additional kind of background information pieces that they had provided that I included in my email. One was a New Yorker article, I think, that Rick had drawn our attention to, and one was a podcast that Bill had drawn our attention to. So if either of you would like to speak to that.
Sure, I can.
Sure, Bill.
I can start. Yeah, I just happened to stumble into that the daily, which had a lot of history around the formation of Israel. What I found interesting about that was that it gave the Israeli and the Palestinian perspectives, as Kathryn was talking about recently, in such a way that each one of them, they're mutually exclusive. You cannot accommodate both. It's impossible because of the way they think. So as you were saying, it's an idea. I shared this information with my Jewish sister-in-law, and she was concerned that and I just wanted to share this with the group, that the interviewer had a bias against Israel, but she felt the ambassador who was in that was very straight and presented both sides fairly in her view. So if you're listening to that, I would encourage you to keep that in the back of your mind. I have to listen to it now and see if that's true, or if I sense that same thing. I also listened to Rick's, and I'll let him talk about it, but that was interesting as well. Remnick is terrific no matter what he's doing. But Rick, go ahead if you want to say any more.
But just quickly, echo? Anyway,
Yeah,
quickly, what's good about the article, it doesn't have the history back behind that we just got this morning from, the overview from Kathryn about pre 1948, but it's quite good at sort of walking you through that. But the real value in the article, for review, the real value in the article is the interviews he did across the boundaries with victims, with warriors, with Israeli defense, IDS people, with politicians, not necessarily far-right politicians, but he includes those as well. So he gives you a real human idea of what it's like to be in these different roles, and just, how, as the quote says in the beginning, you really, this is not a binary situation, and it's not at all an easy, we support those or we support these, or these are bad and these are good. It's a very complex human problem, and it's going to take a human solution to do it. And I'll just finish by saying, to Brinley's remarks about her son, I can't imagine that that small groups, classroom perhaps size or something else at the high school, maybe starting with older kids or something, leaders,
like
wouldn't benefit from hearing direct. You're obviously a very experienced teacher, and I would, if I were a parent, if I were Brinley, I would love to see you in the classroom giving a little bit of this history, and helping them understand, how do you source things, and why do you not want to fall into the trap that our country seems to be drowning in, of misinformation and laziness when it comes to these things. So yeah. I hope you'll consider that. You don't need to respond to that. It's not a challenge. You're a busy woman, so you're great to spend this time.
Delighted to. I love teaching. I would be delighted to. I miss it. I miss kids.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm sorry, what?
Ricky had her hand up
a
while ago, actually.
Okay. I see Pat's got his hand up, and then Brinley, and then we can see if Ricky wanted to add something. So Pat?
Yes, Kathryn, I was reading somebody, maybe at the Times, about before the October 7th brutal attacks. There were a number of Palestinian and Jewish groups, small groups, I guess, but they were working towards peace, and have been for years and years, and you don't hear about them very much. But
right,
I guess that movement has been definitely, that attack, the Hamas has just made, like you said, the Jewish Israel has decided to unify right now to defend itself.
Actually, Pat, those groups are still working together. There's 3 or 4 organizations that I know of. I read this really heartwarming, it was a short piece about this Muslim woman and Jewish woman who've been working actually south of, I can't remember the city, it's south of Jerusalem on the way to Gaza, but it's not quite there. It's away from Beersheba, away from the desert, going towards the coast. And they've been working for decades together. And when October 7th happened, the Muslim woman drove to the Jewish woman's house and just held her, and they just sobbed and cried. And what I loved about that was they both recognized each other's humanity and pain and suffering. And, you know, that's what's really critical about building these relationships. I didn't include, there's a great study that we didn't get to talk about. There was a month before October 7th, there was a poll, and by a very reputable pollster in Jerusalem, who works in the Arab, I'm looking for it right now, works in the Arab communities. And so what he did was there was a series of questions. And one of the reasons why I refer to Palestine, Gaza, and the Golan, or Israeli Arabs, is because they have very different ideas about the other. One of the biggest challenges with Gaza is that their education is so bad. So when Gazan Palestinians were asked, how many Jews do you think live in Israel? They said about 1 million. How many Arabs do you think live in Israel? About 4 million. And they've been brought up on anti-Semitic tropes. They've been brought up, they're just abysmal. And it's not because Hamas controls it. This was going on when Fatah controlled it. So the pollster asked a number of questions, and they were the same questions. And they asked them of Gazans, Jerusalemites, Israeli Arabs, and West Bankers. Questions like, do you believe in a two-state solution? And the answers varied. So Gazans rejected it. I'm going to say 80-something%. I'm making up a number, but it was really high. It was the Israeli Arabs who said 50-50%. And it's because they live with Jews. They know Jews. They work with Jews. They have Jewish friends. They go to Jewish dinner parties. And then the Jerusalemites were even closer because, again, they have much more sustained contact with the Jewish community and the Christian community in Jerusalem, in and around Jerusalem. And then the West Bank Arabs were they above Hamas. You know, there was more people who believed in a two-state solution, but it wasn't a big margin. And so it's really important too to think that we're not talking about the Palestinians as some kind of unified monolith. Same way we're not talking about Israelis that are a unified monolith. Remember the protests and Likud, and I mean yeah, we have to think about those kinds of nuances.
Yeah, definitely. Brinley, did you want to add something?
Yes, actually, I agree with Rick about having a little more education towards it. The reason I raised my hand was also to touch on what Kathryn was just talking about with the nuances. And I think what my son, who is a senior in high school, was looking for was how to strike the empathetic balance for both sides. We, as a family, and him as his own individual, have a lot of Jewish friends and family, and understand their suffering and where they're coming from. But he is also in class and has friends who are Palestinian and have Palestinian families who are also suffering. And so it's when the kids get together and try to have a conversation and try to find having their own voice as opposed to the voice of their parents, in wanting to express mutual empathy for all sides involved, and that it isn't, nothing's monolithic, to use that word again. And that I think that's what he was looking for, and what has, the conversation that the friends are trying to have and understand with each other, and feel like that's the part that's not being taught, of how to maintain empathetic on both sides of the equation, while understanding that the history is long and varied and complicated. Hamas are terrorists, but Netanyahu isn't a saint. So trying to walk that line between the two, having to walk that line is, I think, what the kids are looking for in conversation and teaching, because I think that's where the challenge is coming from.
Brinley, I would encourage you to encourage him not to think about it as walking a line. So there's some things that are unequivocal. So Hamas and terrorism and violence to achieve an end, a political end, is beyond the pale. Doesn't matter what side it comes from. Doesn't matter what person, what entity it comes from. So if we start there and we say this is unequivocal, we're going to start here, and then we say we have to feel for the Israelis who suffered this extraordinarily brutal attack, which reminded them, again, remember the psychological, one of the barriers to peace is the psychological process. This is very reminiscent of the Holocaust. I mean, people, the decimation of people who thought they were safe. And we also have to recognize that the Palestinians are under corrupt, immoral leadership, that they have virtually, under the Palestinian leadership, they've had virtually no opportunity for economic success, educational success, peace. At the same time, they're suffering tremendously right now in Gaza and in the West Bank. The increase in settler attacks against Palestinians has increased exponentially since 10/7, and the IDF forces are deployed to the south. Now, there are some in the West Bank, but what you have are settlers who are driving these nomadic groups that are, they have huge plots of land where they're grazing goats and they're grazing sheep, and they're being driven off the land. And they're afraid because this is the Nakba again. One of the most frequent questions I get asked about this is, why won't Egypt let the Palestinians in? Palestinians don't want to go into Egypt because that's another refugee camp they'll be in, and their kids will be in, and their kids will be in for the next 100 years. They don't want another Nakba. At the same time, they do want, I mean, when they're injured and things like that, but they don't want a population expulsion. Egypt doesn't want them either, because that's another, they have enough problems with Islamic extremism in the Sinai. They don't want to deal with instability in Sinai. The second question I get asked a lot is, in 1948, why didn't the Arab countries take in the Palestinians? Why didn't they all just say, hey, you have a state here? And one of the ways I would answer that is, when Russia invaded Ukraine, why didn't they just move to Belarus? Because the Ukrainians, the Russians, and the Belarusians are their dialects are mutually intelligible. They're the same Slavic group of people, but it's not their home. So it's, why didn't they take them in? I mean, Jordan did, but they didn't want to be someplace. And when you read the article that or the transcript, you listen, or I read the transcript, I didn't listen to what Bill Ramaj had circulated. These imaginations keep, every time there's an attack, every time there's an incident, this psychological trigger of Nakba, Holocaust, Nakba, Holocaust. And that's a framework. And what you have are two competing victimhoods, frankly. And it's multi-generational. This is not one generation, it's multi-generational. These are kids who say in Gaza or in the West Bank, where you say, where are you from? They say Ashdod, which is Israel. They've never seen Ashdod. They've never seen Akko, but that's where their grandmother's from. So that's where they're from mentally.
Interesting. I wanted to circle back to Ricky. Did you want to add something to the conversation, Ricky?
Well, I'm listening to it with rapt attention, Kathryn. You're masterful, and I really I appreciate all the work that went into this presentation. But I'm looking at it from the standpoint of someone of lived experience. Okay, my family had its roots in Austria, and when Hitler came, we couldn't stay. We would have been up the chimney. So we left, as did any who could get out. And when I came to America, it was 1947. And it was the beginning of Israel as well. And since that time, well, in a Jewish family, when you during the Seder, you wish people a happy holiday, and the next phrase is next year in Jerusalem. And that is something that's been part of our tradition for thousands of years, since Roman times. And the diaspora we've had multiple diasporas, whether it was from Spain in 1492, or the expulsion of the Jews from England, or the expulsion of the Jews from Poland, or however you want to look at it, whichever expulsion you date from, that's where you start from. Well, I start from the Nazi era. I don't go back to 1492 that I know of. I'm sure I did. There were ancestors, but I don't know who they are. But at any rate, in terms of lived experience, my lived experience with the land is, first of all, biblical, and secondly, the creation of the state. And the first thing that happened was the war to deny that international solution to, quote, the problem, us. So, and it seems that whether I was 10 years old at the time, so I wasn't doing much reading, or whether it was factual or propaganda. I just know what I heard, that the Arabs attacked, or that there was attack on what was Israel. And that's sort of my starting point. And it seems that every time there was a challenge, it was a challenge from the non-Jewish side. There was a war in '67. There was a war in the Yom Kippur War, and there were wars that, on record, were started by the non-Jewish party to this dispute. So that in my lived experience, I tend to feel that Israel, that it's a continuation of the millennium-long saga of displacing and killing the Jews. Now, my middle name is Esther, and Esther relates to the story of Purim, which is a story of the attempt at the extermination of the Jews in Persia. And that the story goes that that the king of Persia held in effect, a beauty contest, and he wanted another wife, and he wanted the most wonderful wife, and apparently the one he chose, he didn't know she was Jewish, but he chose Esther. And Esther in the story persuades King Ahasuerus not to follow Haman's advice, which was to exterminate the Jews. So it's interesting to me that was Haman of 1,000 years ago, and Hamas is the current slaughterer of Jews. So I have that sort of psychological mix in my head. And, I was in shul when the Yom Kippur War was announced. In '67, we had an assassination of an American president, and it seemed a timely time for a war by somebody. It's hard to those were the sort of the traumas that registered in my lived history of Israel and the rest of the world. And so it's hard to disregard that and be unbiased and be but I've lived long enough, 86 years at latest count, to realize that war is not a solution. It is not a solution to the human condition. And attempts at peace have to be where we all work. And I have a problem with the I don't know how to put it, with the finger always being pointed at the Jewish people, whether it's Israel or Jews in other circumstances, like the Jews run the world and they're the ones who they're the master manipulators on Wall Street and on wherever else, that we seem to be the default scapegoat of history. And it's very hard to be dispassionate under those circumstances.
Yeah.
Now, the young people haven't lived through that. And so when I see what's happening on the college campuses, my heart bleeds for those kids, because they're going to be our future. They're our future. And somehow we can't get through to them that says there's a common humanity here that we have to care about. I don't have an answer,
Yeah.
but I can just share what I've lived through.
Yeah. Ricky, thanks so much for sharing that. You have a perspective that a lot of us don't have, or at least don't have firsthand, the way you have lived it. And I think it harkens back to some of what Kathryn said in her earliest slides of we're all involved because we're all human beings. But Kathryn, let me offer you a chance to just either respond to anything that Ricky has said or offer some closing thoughts, and then maybe we can wrap up for this morning.
Ricky, thank you so much for sharing that. I know you and I have talked about this together. I don't think you should be dispassionate. I mean, how could you?
I wait for all the innocents that have died, whether they're Israeli or Palestinian. Believe me, that.
Ricky, I wish I were there to give you a big hug. I hate that you're so far away.
Yeah.
I think that what's really important is for us to listen to the lived experience, listen to people who, and acknowledge our common humanity. And also, I mean, I spent a good deal of my presentation laying the groundwork for the problems we're having today. And it's, it started with the anti-Semitism, anti-Jew. I mean, this has been going on, as you said, for millennia. It only got really nasty with the arrival of, and when I say really nasty, I'm talking about, in my earlier slides, I kept talking about the Jewish question. And that was what the Brits, the French, the Germans, these nation states said. And then they said, here's the solution. And they came up with, but then I never understood when Hitler said this was the final solution. I didn't understand the context of that until I started researching what the problem was. And so the French, the Germans, the Brits, they come up with all these solutions to a problem. And it culminates in the mass extermination of 6 million Jews. 13 million people. 13 million non-Soviets. So if you add in the Soviets, it gets a lot. The numbers are, but we never
Well,
did that.
And
So-
if you add the mass graves that they've been discovering recently in villages and places all over what was the Soviet Union, your numbers go up from the 6 million. Because those weren't murdered by the Nazis; they were murdered by the villagers in Russia and in the states surrounding.
Yeah.
So yeah. Oh dear God.
Horrific. Yeah. Well, again, Kathryn, thank you so much for giving this perspective. Thanks for everybody for participating. Ricky, thanks for, again, sharing your unique experience on this.
And I have to say one thing. That's why being accepted by the town of Natick as its first breaking a tradition of only electing men by electing me into that position. That's why it means so much to me, because it's an acceptance and a trust of someone who, in my country of my birth would have killed me. And I am so, to this day, grateful to the people of Natick for accepting me, for trusting me. To me, that is, it's the most, I can't express how much that has meant to me and still means to me, and why I will never break my ties with the town and the people of Natick.
I
That's
think
why
the life of public service you've led says a lot about what it means to you, Ricky. And we're all beneficiaries of that.
That's why I'll be buried in Natick. Well, I have a plot there.
Hopefully many years from now.
And,
We need you to stay healthy and keep coming. I'm going to close the recording at this point.